My husband always insisted on splitting expenses 50-50, even for my prenatal checkups. Yet, he paid the down payment for his first love's house and over 5 years of our marriage, helped her pay off the remaining mortgage. The screenshot of the early settlement was shared by his first love in a mutual friends group. She boasted to her girlfriends, "Choosing a man is like investing. But who says I can't invest in someone else's man?" The group responded with a flood of approval, and I couldn't help but give a thumbs-up comment. The next second, I was kicked out of the group. My husband called me furious. "Sarah is the widow of my comrade. What's wrong with taking care of her and her child? How dare you make sarcastic comments?" He yelled. Sarah was crying beside him. Before I could respond, he hung up. Half an hour later, Sarah posted on her social media a picture of the new car my husband had bought her. I knew she was taunting me, but holding the divorce papers in my hand, I no longer cared. Chapter 1. I had just been kicked out of the group when my husband David called. At that moment, I was at the prenatal checkup, and everyone in the corridor could hear David shouting at me. "Emily, I realize you've become really troublesome since you got pregnant. How dare you interfere in my affairs? They're struggling, and you know why. How could you still follow the comments brainlessly? You're becoming disgusting. Have you lost your mind because of the pregnancy?" People passing by gave me disdainful looks. How klitsch. My husband becoming someone else's support, it could happen to me too. I took a deep breath and replied. The ones who are truly idle are those in the group, blindly supporting someone else. There was silence on the other end of the line. The onlookers in the corridor gave me sympathetic glances and then walked away. I never fought back against David, never said anything to hurt his pride, and always admitted my faults even when he unjustly accused me. Everyone in the family knew I was the most tolerant wife to David. Then, I heard soft sobbing from the other end. Sarah was beside him. David then whispered, "Couldn't you have spoken to me privately? They're struggling, and you had to make things awkward for everyone? Now apologize to her." His words were meant to remind me that we were married and should resolve issues privately. He was also hinting that I had damaged his image, especially since he was the boss. But what did it matter? He was still siding with Sarah. I glanced at the big screen, seeing that I was next for the checkup. I responded firmly, "No way." Before hanging up, I added, "Since you're so protective, I wish you and your first love a lifetime of happiness together." Before the call ended, I heard David slamming his desk and shouting, "Emily, what do you mean by that? Explain yourself." I straightened my bangs and walked into the examination room. I remembered when I first got pregnant, David insisted on accompanying me to the checkups, saying that early involvement would foster a bond with the child. Now, when I mentioned a checkup, he would impatiently respond, "You're an adult, do you still need company to see a doctor? I have so much work, how can I revolve around you?" As he left, he slammed the door heavily. Indeed, he didn't revolve around me. He revolved around Sarah. During the checkup, the doctor reminded me to ensure proper nutrition. Lately, I had been too stressed to eat much, but I had to think of the baby. After buying some groceries, I saw David and Sarah standing together in matching black and white jackets. She feigned surprise and then dragged David over. "Emily, what are you doing here?" David didn't want to come to avoid suspicion, but I insisted since you're pregnant and it's inconvenient for you. Next time, just let me know what you need. David stood beside her, looking stern, not even glancing at me. In the past, he had accompanied her to the supermarket too. I had specifically told David not to get too close to Sarah to avoid rumors, which would be bad for both of them, especially since their workplaces were nearby. But he had lashed out at me, thinking I was being unreasonable. "Emily, what do you have in your head? She's the girlfriend of my deceased comrade. He was my closest comrade. I've explained many times that there's nothing between Sarah and me. You're being excessive. Think it over." Like a punishment, he immediately left and spent the night at Sarah's place. Back then, I would feel hurt, tossing and turning, unable to sleep well. But now, seeing them together, I felt nothing. I turned my gaze away, not intending to respond. Sarah, noticing my indifference, put on a pitiful and apologetic smile. "I'm sorry if I was out of line. You're the wife, I shouldn't have said something so presumptuous." Her words seemed considerate but actually highlighted my failure. David, looking down at me, said, "She's ungrateful. Let her shop alone. She'll learn her lesson when she's exhausted." With that, he left with Sarah. I took my groceries and caught a cab home. The evening sunset was beautiful, casting a golden glow. I felt a bit better. I took a picture to share. Opening my phone, I saw Sarah's latest post. David said he would fulfill every promise he made to me. The picture was of a property deed. People were congratulating her, and she replied only to David with a shy, blushing emoji. It felt like she was showing off how well she was being treated. But it left me cold. After all, David and I were still paying off the mortgage on our house, each contributing $5,000 a month. Chapter 2. When David and I got married, we were broke. There was no wedding, and even the $1.5 engagement ring was bought after comparing prices at several stores. But I didn't mind. I believed that a boy needed time to become a man. Moreover, he promised to make it up to me when we had money. For years, I stood by him as he started his company. I was his secretary during business meetings, and at the office, I was the secretary, accountant, and hour. From a two-person operation, we grew to a company with dozens of employees. Yet, the habit of splitting expenses persisted. I didn't mind, thinking that once we were married, there was no distinction between his and mine. But little did I know, he turned around and bought a house outright for his comrade's girlfriend. And my wedding ring and ceremony were never even mentioned. I quietly closed my social media and made myself a hearty dinner. Just as I finished, David walked in. Seeing the food on the table, he mocked. "You sure know how to treat yourself at home. Why don't you feel any guilt? Emily, you weren't like this before." I didn't respond. Instead, I took out the divorce papers and bluntly said, "Let's get divorced. I've already prepared the agreement. Just sign it, and we can go to the civil affairs office tomorrow." He paused while taking off his jacket. "Divorce? Have you lost your mind because of the pregnancy? We've been together for 11 years. It's not 11 years, it's 12. The extra year was when I helped you through your heartbreak." Sarah was his first love. When he found out, he cried for a day and a night, and I stayed by his side, afraid he might do something rash. "I've made up my mind." With that, I stood up to go to my room. He grabbed my arm roughly, causing a sharp pain in my stomach. He didn't notice my furrowed brow, too focused on his own argument. "I'll explain one last time. Yes, she was my first love, but I married you. I wouldn't do anything to betray you. I'm close to her because she's my comrade's widow. I can't just watch her and her child suffer. What about me?" I looked him in the eye, my voice surprisingly calm. "Do I deserve to be sacrificed? If that's the case, David, you'd be better off dead." He stared at me in disbelief, his eyes wide. "Emily, what did you say? You want me dead? Your own husband? I've explained countless times. She's my comrade's widow. It's my duty to take care of her." I didn't want to argue anymore. A lie repeated enough times becomes the truth, even to oneself. He kept saying, "Comrade." But anyone unaware would think they were best friends. In reality, they were barely acquaintances from school. Chapter 3. Seeing my indifference, David tore up the divorce papers. "You're in your 30s acting like a 20-something girl. Do you think you can find someone else with your wrinkles if we divorce?" With that, he stormed out. That night, he didn't come home, and I didn't bother to check on him. He had scattered paper all over the food, so I simply ordered takeout. David and I had fought numerous times over Sarah, the worst being when I left his company and accepted a high-paying job elsewhere. After he begged for reconciliation, I regretted my impulsiveness. Looking back, it was the best decision I made in our marriage. The next day, I went to work. During lunch, I overheard colleagues discussing a new celebrity couple. I turned to look and saw it was Sarah. Opening my phone, I found that David and Sarah had made headlines. There were two pictures, one of a camping scene with David tending to a grill and the other of Sarah's child sitting in David's lap, eating barbecue. Comments were filled with blessings for their long-lasting love, mistaking them for a family. Curious followers clicked and shared, making it go viral. By evening, the picnic photos had topped the trending list, with the second being David's identity. Emily, can you believe this world? Did you see the news? That David not only loves his wife and kid but also owns a company, and it's not a small company. They just landed the ex.Okay hotel project. They're going to make a fortune. My coworker pointed at David's picture as we shared a cab home. I smiled but said nothing. Indeed, it's a lot of money. Otherwise, David wouldn't be frantically messaging me, urging me not to say anything online. Back home, I took the divorce agreement to David's office. Inside, David and Sarah were discussing whether to clarify the situation publicly. The ex.Okay hotel project wasn't finalized yet, and David's company was still competing. If the project went through, being in the headlines would be like free advertising, pleasing the clients. But their family facade was fake. If competitors exposed this, they were done for. Even clarifying would damage their reputation. David, I fully support whatever you decide. This is my fault. I should have warned you about the picnic crowd. It's not your fault. I wanted to take you and the child for a picnic. Don't worry, I won't let this affect you and the child. When I walked in, Sarah was sitting on the sofa, with David kneeling in front of her, holding her hand and making promises. Seeing me, Sarah quickly withdrew her hand, and David stood up to block her. I found it amusing. They weren't gold, I had no interest in them. I brought the divorce agreement. Once you sign it, you two can get married and be a legitimate couple without worrying about exposure. Chapter 4. As I spoke, David's frown deepened. Emily, the company is at a critical stage. Stop causing trouble. I wasn't causing trouble. I was clearer than ever. Since Sarah appeared, we'd been fighting repeatedly, and I was genuinely exhausted and devoid of any love for David. This day was destined from the moment he first abandoned me for Sarah. I mean it. I was serious when I brought it up at home. He tried to grab my hand and pull me aside to talk. I couldn't break free, and he closed the office door with a loud bang. Emily, I know this is a woman's way of seeking attention. I get it, all right? As I was about to speak, he continued. You're pregnant. If you're upset, go home and rest. Some things shouldn't be said carelessly. No need. I'm very calm. David, today you either sign the divorce papers or we both go down. His pretense of good temper vanished instantly. Ignoring Sarah, who had come to check, he said, Emily, do you think I want the kid that badly? Besides me, who else would you go to? As he spoke, he stormed out. Before I could leave, he returned with the divorce agreement. Sarah hastily held him back, urging him to calm down, not to argue with a pregnant woman. Don't put on a show for me. I said either we divorce or we go down together. David said nothing, his face darkening. Maybe he still thought I was bluffing. When he handed me the signed papers, he looked triumphant. What a fool! Chapter 5. Returning home, I looked at the house where I had lived for so many years, feeling a surge of emotions. This house was bought by both David and me, with both our names on it. I once thought I would live here forever, but now it was my last night here. The divorce agreement was clear, the house would belong to David, along with the remaining mortgage. Given his current financial situation, he could easily afford it. I had to pack the next day, so I went to bed early. In a daze, I heard David return, asking how the prenatal checkup went. When his hand touched my belly, I woke up instantly. Seeing David, I regretted not leaving tonight with my belongings. I discussed it with Sarah. After this project ends, I'll get our marriage certificate back. he said, leaning against the headboard, opening his arms as if expecting me to embrace him with excitement. What a fool. I ignored him, took my blanket, and walked out. Emily, there's a limit to how much you can act out. No one has the patience to always give you a way out. I didn't want to talk. Who knows when it started, but I had lost all interest in talking to David. David blocked the door, so I returned to bed. Just when I thought he was going to lose patience and leave, he showed me a photo on his phone. It was my grandfather. In the photo, he wore a half-faded green coat and smiled kindly. I suddenly understood why David was so confident I wouldn't leave. I grew up in a single-parent household. My father cheated, and my mother and grandparents raised me together. After some unforeseen events, by the time I reached adulthood, only my grandfather was left. His greatest wish was for me to have a family and child of my own and live a peaceful life. I had brought David to meet my grandfather, who liked him very much. I called the nursing home. They said your grandfather has a congenital heart condition and can't handle stress. David was threatening me, and I couldn't find a way out. My grandfather was over 100 years old and couldn't take much stress. David stayed, sleeping soundly. Once he was asleep, I took my necessary documents, changed clothes, and left. Chapter 6. Sitting on the hotel bed, I thought about many things repeatedly. David's calls brought me back to reality. Seeing it was 9 in the morning, I stuck to my initial plan. I took a cab to the hospital and scheduled the procedure. David called several times. I didn't answer. When calls went unanswered, he started sending messages, threatening to tell my grandfather that I was missing if I didn't respond. I ignored them all. I had already told my grandfather I was going to be as brave as my mother and follow her path. Just before entering the operating room, David arrived. He stopped me. Emily, have you lost your mind? This is our child. I won't let you do this. I was surprised, asking how he knew I was at this hospital. I had purposely chosen a distant hospital to avoid complications. He showed me his phone, revealing an alert from a shared account. I realized this was something we had set up when we first got together. My phone was linked to his information and his was linked to mine. It was meant to take better care of each other, but now it was being used this way. I felt like laughing. So, he had always known about my illnesses but never visited, always staying with Sarah instead. We're already divorced. There's no need to keep it. I said after this project, we'll remarry. The nurse came out, asking if I was proceeding. David cursed under his breath, dragging me out. He forcefully put me in the passenger seat. Emily, today is the project's finalization day. Please don't cause trouble now. I looked at the family picture of him and Sarah on the dashboard, saying nothing. I never expected David to be so greedy. When we lived in a 20 square meter rental, he promised me forever. Now, after starting a company and making money, he juggled 2 women and blamed one for not being obedient. David took me back to the company. In the underground parking lot, Sarah hurried over to help him change and adjust his tie. Emily, I'm sorry for the rush. Don't misunderstand. David turned to me explaining. Sarah and I got our marriage certificate. She did nothing wrong. Everything was for the project. Please understand. With that, he hurried off. After he left, Sarah showed me the little family picture from the car, asking if I liked it. I found her challenging gaze amusing. She thought I wanted David and couldn't let go. But I had already decided to end the pregnancy. What was David to me? The style is fine, but the people are disgusting. If you like the trash, keep it. There are plenty more sets at home for you. Sarah's smile froze. I didn't want to waste more words with her and turned to leave. Chapter 7. The day after the procedure, my grandfather visited me. He handed me a washed apple, asking if I had made up my mind. I was surprised. Hadn't we already discussed this? Emily, David called me and explained everything. He said it's his duty to take care of his comrade's widow and her child. I was silent for a moment. My grandfather had indeed taken David's call. But it's different. My grandfather was over 100 years old. His era's comrades were different. Grandpa, David and his so-called comrade met less than 10 times. He helps because she was his first love. Grandpa didn't grasp my meaning. Impossible. David said they were like brothers. Brothers? I was stunned. David mainly worked in the kitchen during his service. Where did he find a life and death friendship? I didn't want to continue the topic, fearing it might upset Grandpa. You two must have had a misunderstanding. I called him over so you can talk. Once you clear things up, everything will be fine. Upon hearing this, I quickly sat up. I have nothing to say to him. I had planned to rest for a couple of days. After changing my admission information, I got myself admitted. But now, I didn't want to stay any longer. Grandpa insisted I stay, calling me Emily repeatedly, trying to persuade me to talk to David, stubborn as ever. Within minutes, David arrived. Grandpa eagerly pushed us together, saying, David told me the project is almost done. Once it's settled, everything will go back to normal. I asked, what about Sarah? What are your plans for her? David replied, she will be as before. I'll also send her some more gifts. Emily, she not only is my comrade's widow but also helped immensely with this project. She handled meetings and negotiations. It would be ungrateful not to show some appreciation. Grandpa nodded in agreement. I looked at Grandpa, unsure if I should tell him the whole truth. In his eyes, David treated me well. But if he knew I was pregnant and still had to work to pay half the mortgage, it might upset him. I've been taking the subway to work while pregnant, but you bought Sarah a car. It's just a car. If you want one, I'll get you one. Grandpa didn't grasp my point and thought we had reconciled. He believed we were going to talk things out and left the room to give us privacy. Inside, David tried to hold my hand, but I slapped him. David, you're a married man and I'm single. Aren't you afraid of making headlines? David looked stunned, first angry, then calm. He pulled out his phone and played a recording. It was a conversation between David and the nursing home director. The recording lasted over 7 minutes, but halfway through, I was already shaken. 3 out of 4 heart chambers blocked, life-threatening. Why had no one told me this before? Your grandfather doesn't know the severity. Emily, only you and I know this. I looked at David, curious about his next words. Your grandfather needs expensive medication to survive. Without me, you can't afford both an elderly person's medical expenses and raising a child. The only way to keep your own family and not lose your last relative is to stay with me. David's voice was casual, as if discussing something insignificant. He acted as if he had me completely under control. I didn't respond immediately, staring at him, suddenly realizing why he never believed I would leave. Because he never respected me, thinking I was dependent on him. But who said I would have a child? I had already ended the pregnancy. After sending Grandpa back to the nursing home, David took me to our old home. Fate is full of surprises. I thought I'd never return here. David turned off the lights, and the next moment, candles lit up the room. Emily, today is our anniversary. I looked at the cake, feeling a surge of nostalgia. Before Sarah appeared, we celebrated our anniversary like this every year. David would order a cake, arrange a specific number of balloons, prepare a gift, and cook for me. Back then, I felt truly loved. Despite our fights over Sarah, I couldn't let go. Try it. I ordered from the same bakery. See if it tastes the same. I took a small forkful and slowly put it in my mouth. Under David's expectant gaze, I shook my head. Years ago, I thought that bakery's cakes were the best. But after letting go of David, they no longer tasted special. David wasn't discouraged, bringing out snacks we loved from college. Looking at the familiar yet distant memories, I suddenly cried. David panicked, quickly wiping my tears and promising we would celebrate every year from now on. But I had no future with him. Chapter 8. The next day, I visited the nursing home director. After thorough verification, my last shred of hope was shattered. Grandpa's heart condition was indeed severe, even worse than the recording implied. Due to his age and physical condition, surgery was not recommended. Medication was the only option. The director paused. Miss Emily, at his age, even with medication, there's a limit on how much longer he can live. Spend as much time with him as you can. I nodded, thanked him, and left. Grandpa saw me and asked if I didn't have to work. I said I took a leave. He then took me around the nursing home, showing me his daily routine. I listened, feeling dazed, and suddenly wanted to resign and stay by his side. I went back to the office and applied for extended leave, using all my available vacation days. Seeing me visit daily, Grandpa initially said it wasn't necessary. But once he was sure it didn't affect my work, he began introducing me to his friends at the nursing home. The director mentioned that Grandpa's spirits had improved significantly in the past few days. I watched Grandpa chatting with his new friends and finally decided to resign. Grandpa had often mentioned the elm tree back home, but due to my job and his health, we only managed a few brief visits during holidays. If his life was nearing its end, I wanted him to return home. On the day I successfully resigned, David showed up at the nursing home. The project is secure now. Where are you staying? I'll help you move. I looked at Grandpa, then turned to David. I'm going back home. Chapter 9. David, we're divorced. I ended the pregnancy. We have no reason to see each other anymore. David scoffed. What about your grandfather? He was reminding me that without him, I couldn't afford Grandpa's medication and raise a child. I was really annoyed. David knew how important Grandpa was to me, yet he always stood against me, using emotional blackmail. Life in the countryside is much cheaper. So, you're planning to marry a farmer? Emily, their conditions can't compare to mine. I've contacted a sperm bank. I've chosen a donor. Before I could finish, David raised his voice. What did you say? Emily, you ended our child just to have someone else's? I didn't want to explain further. There was no point. I turned to leave but saw Sarah talking to Grandpa. Panicking, I rushed over. Seeing me, Grandpa immediately took my hand. David, you make Emily pay half the mortgage while buying Sarah a house and car? Even if she's a widow, this is too much. I worried Grandpa would get too agitated, quickly calming him down. David hastily explained, saying the house was for our child's future schooling and the car for convenient transportation. Grandpa wasn't convinced, pulling me to leave. Sir, you can't just look at the past. I can give Emily everything in the future. Without me, she would never have these. She's in her 30s, divorced, and had an abortion. How will she find someone better than me? David. I never expected David to say such things in front of my grandfather, knowing how fragile he was. I pulled Grandpa away, and we left that afternoon, taking the next train back home. Emily, am I a burden to you? No. The burden was David. Without him, I would have bought a house long ago. Don't worry, I have savings, and I got a settlement from the divorce. We'll be fine for a long time. Chapter 10. 2 months later, Sarah found me. I was surprised, not expecting her to find this place. My family had moved when I was young to give me better opportunities. I barely remembered it myself. She was direct, opening a suitcase full of money. Here's $1 million. I want you to never contact David again. Or... She glanced inside the house. I'll buy exposure and say you're the other woman. I didn't respond immediately, instead calling a lawyer friend to ask about this situation. They assured me that this money was rightfully mine. I felt relieved. Fine. But if he contacts me, that's out of my control. Don't worry. As long as you don't seek him out, I won't let him know you're here. After that, Sarah left without looking back. Living back home, Grandpa's health improved. The doctor said it was a good sign, advising continued nutrition and mental well-being. But there wasn't much for me to do. Along with Grandpa, there were 2 other centenarians in the village. The three of them met daily, chatting and laughing. 6 months later, David showed up in the village. A neighbor told me she saw a man asking about me, and she didn't recognize him, warning me to be careful. Just as she finished, David appeared at the alley's entrance. "Emily, I've been looking for you everywhere. Please, just listen to me. Just a few words." David blocked my way, saying he had divorced Sarah. "Emily, I meant everything I said. Sarah was just a comrade's widow, then about the project. I gave her a sum of money. We're no longer in contact. Please believe me one more time. I know she was manipulative, but I was confused, clinging to my comrade's memory." "So, you watched me break down repeatedly with clarity?" "I didn't understand and didn't want to think anymore." "Emily, let's go back. I've arranged the best hospital for your grandfather. Let's go." He held my hand, eyes filled with a sorrow I'd never seen. But I no longer needed it. I genuinely felt nothing for him. I pulled my hand away, speaking calmly. "David, my grandfather's condition has stabilized. I've also been contacted by the sperm bank. David, we can't go back. I really don't love you anymore and don't want to continue with you." I went back inside. For the next few days, David lingered, hanging around the door every day. Initially, I feared Grandpa's reaction, but with his friend's support, he quickly treated David like air. "Emily, if I stay here, do we have a chance?" "No." I stopped, looking at David, and said formally, "I've informed the village head. From now on, the villagers won't let you in freely. From now on, let's go our separate ways as strangers."